it is possible for a leader to become the victim of someone else's story. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that sometimes someone will tell a story because it makes them feel better, or they'll tell a story that seems to point in a certain direction as far as outcomes or concepts or philosophies or political gain or financial gain. And sometimes the telling of that story has, well, like zero basis in truth. It's nothing more than a story told for the purpose of manipulation. And sometimes the leader is the victim of that story, but sometimes those in influence, those with power, especially those that other people look to for stories, they are the manipulators. They are the ones that make someone else the victim of their story. Welcome to Leading Leaders Podcast. 5-minute videos, 5 days a week. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. I don't know if you've ever been the heel of the story or the heel of the joke, so to speak. And I think we've all been kind of the butt of the joke at some point in time, even if it was back as far as middle school, where someone accused us of something or pointed out a characteristic about us. You know, the old idea of a caricature might look at you and say, this is one feature that's really pronounced about you. Maybe for me, it was always the size of my ears like Dumbo. But maybe there's a feature about you that other people make fun of. The way that you talk, a lisp that you have, the accent that you have, the way that you walk, because, you know, maybe you've got bad knees or scoliosis, or you just learned to walk funny, or maybe you got bad ankles. But see, those little microcosmic flaws that we all have, everybody has them. I haven't met a perfect person face to face yet. Because we all have them, it's easy for people to make up stories about them. It's easy for people to say, oh yeah, well, so-and-so did such and such because of, or that's why they do. And those stories sometimes come back to haunt you. The real challenge with those stories is when the story causes emotional damage or financial damage or relational damage. They can't be undone. Imagine for a moment if someone accused you in front of your spouse or accused you to your spouse of being unfaithful. Imagine how hard it would be, even if there was no truth to the story, for you now to come back and cover up or correct or fix the elements of damage done in the emotional psyche, in the relationship itself, when you've been lied on, for lack of a better term, when something's been told about you that has no basis in truth whatsoever. It's just a baseless accusation. It gets really difficult to try to maintain relationships, especially when you know that someone is out to get you. Maybe you've worked in a workplace like that, a hostile work environment where someone would rather accuse you of what they've done wrong than to take the blame themselves. They don't want to be fired. They know that it was a bad idea, or they know that they ruined that customer transaction, or they know that they broke that product or dismantled that service in some way that it's going to cost the company money and it might cost them their job. And it's a whole lot easier to blame it on you than it is to take the blame themselves. See, stories that have the ability to undermine a leader, that have the ability to sabotage an entire organization, those kinds of stories rest on the tongues of anyone with a little bit of vengeance in their heart. It rests on the tongue of anyone with a little bit of boldness toward getting their way, toward their own victory, toward their own winning of their goals at all cost. Now, I know that when we talk about media, a lot of times it's a left-right political kind of thing, but when it comes to stories, I want you to think for a moment of the number of times that you've heard a story that was detrimental to whoever they told the story on. Maybe it was a law enforcement officer, maybe it was a large organization and their CEO, maybe it was a political candidate. But the story itself was so devastating. The story, just the story being reported, changed the outcome of so many things. The re-election of a political candidate, the hiring or the firing of a CEO. Yes, we all know CEOs who've lost their job over things that were reported in the media. But what if those stories were lies? What if there's a fabrication that's going on? What if the whole story was made up for someone else's benefit? What if the whole story had nothing to do with truth? In fact, there were no facts or evidence in it. It wasn't possible to corroborate it. Well, what if the person telling that story has done the same thing before? See, we know that major media outlets around the world have had to do what we call print a retraction, where they walk back a story and they go, sorry, we reported these 6 facts, and 4 of those 6 facts are true, but the other 2, well, they didn't have any truth in them, but they did have a bearing on the outcome of the story, or at least the conclusions that were drawn by the person who wrote the story, or even the people who read the story. Well, what if those made up facts, those extra facts, the extraneous facts, what if they were the ones that made a decision that people reacted on? I bring this up today because I know we've all experienced it in the work environment. We've all had someone at some point blame something on us that wasn't our fault. We've had to take credit or blame for a bad idea, for a bad outcome. As leaders, that's kind of our job. And I know that sounds harsh, but it really is. Part of the objective of the leader is to be aware of what's going on, to be able to absorb that blow and say, okay, I'm responsible for my team. As a leader, I'm responsible for the outcome of the overall project. As a leader, I'm responsible for what happens here. And if that means that I have people on my team who are willing to sabotage each other or sabotage the whole team for their own personal gain, even if I'm not responsible for the sabotage, I'm responsible for letting that person remain on the team. I'm going to have to do something about it. But see, in the world of politics and fast-moving news, in the world of trials and people being thrown out of their own businesses, these fake stories, they have huge consequences. Just an example, kind of the one that got me thinking along this line was the Washington Post. They released a story back in late December, early January about a phone call that supposedly took place between the then president and election officials in another state. And the accusation was that the president bullied these people into coming to a certain conclusion. Well, now we find out 3 months later, after the election is over, after the outcome can't be challenged, after the courts refuse to hear the argument, that the phone call never happened. It was completely made up. Now, it may have changed the outcome of voting in our country. It may have changed the outcome. In fact, what was claimed in the story was used in an impeachment trial. Well, can we undo the impeachment trial now that we know that the claim in the story was a lie? It wasn't just not completely true, it was entirely fabricated. I'm reminded of a particular commentator, anchor, from, it's been 12 years ago now, during an election campaign, made up a whole story. The entire story had 0 merit and 0 truth. Made up the entire story about a political candidate. And when it was all said and done, they asked him, did you know at the time that you told the story, that you reported that story, were you aware then that what you said was untrue? And he said, yes. I knew then that it had no truth in it, but I also knew that it would sway the outcome of the election. And I said, well, do you feel embarrassed or do you feel convicted by having told a lie of that magnitude? And he looked the camera right in the eye and he said, well, that SOB is not our president now, is he? That was his justification. The ends justify the means. He was so convinced that that individual would be a bad president that he would sacrifice his own career, his integrity, his professionalism, his job, even his industry, on the altar of making sure that his outcome was achieved. If you think as a leader that you're immune to that, if you think as a leader that no one in your organization would ever stoop to that level to make up lies about you just for their own gain, you, my friend, are delusional. As a leader, it's almost inevitable. Stories will be made up, some of them out of whole cloth. There will be no merit, no truth whatsoever to the story, and it will be detrimental to yourself, to your organization, to your organization's income or strength in the market. And when that happens, as the leader, your number one role is to take responsibility. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you take the blame or the fall for the supposed story. What it means is you figure out where the lies are coming from and you go after the story itself and the storyteller. That sometimes is the hardest part of the leadership role, to understand that you will be sabotaged. It's almost inevitable because we're surrounded by humans who would love to have your job. They would love to have your role. They would love to have your influence. And if they can get it by lying, many of them will. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day. Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.